This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
This is Robert Blumen, editor of Software Engineering Radio. If you're hearing this, that means you're a listener of the show. But have you ever thought about being a host? It's a great way to talk to some of the most interesting people in the industry and get 30 to 40,000 people to hear your thoughts. Contact us, team@se-radio.net for more information.
Your code is powerful, and so are you. And when you consider the reach of your code, it's clear that to deliver quality code, you must also deliver secure code. Where can you start? A first step is educating yourself on basic secure coding principles and beginning to put these principles into practice every day. Vericode's Secure Coding Toolkit is your go-to resource for all your secure coding needs. The benefits of our toolkit include learning best practices for secure coding, understanding how to secure your DevOps environments, learning to combat the most common software vulnerabilities. Stay secure and download this valuable asset today at www.vericode.com/SERadio.
This is Nate Black for Software Engineering Radio. My guest today is Joel Spolsky. Joel is CEO and co-founder of Stack Overflow. Prior to Stack Overflow, he was co-founder of Fog Creek Software, which spun off Trello, which is now part of Atlassian, and is now producing Glitch. Joel, welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Thanks, and thank you for having me on. It's nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Your bio on your blog, joelonsoftware.com, says very modestly that you're a software developer living in New York City.
Okay. Technically true, yeah.
Technically true, but I think probably everyone listening to this show has used Stack Overflow, and probably a lot of them have used the other products that you've produced.
I hope so.
I just want to give our listeners a sense of scale of what Stack Overflow is like today, just to put things in perspective.
Sure. It's big. There's a few different ways we look at it. One thing that surprises people is that it's a top 50 website globally, I think. And it kind of depends on whose traffic metrics you're looking at. But we've been a top 50 website for a long time, and we get more unique visitors than Apple.com, which sort of surprises people. Part of it really is you can't talk to a developer that doesn't use Stack Overflow regularly. So it's kind of a required part. It's a required tool for doing software development. And that's pretty amazing because I don't know how many other required tools there are. Everybody has some kind of version control, but I think there's some popular ones like Git, but there's some variety there. You need a compiler, but everybody's got a different compiler. But you kind of can't live without Stack Overflow.
Yeah, that's true. And I'd like to talk more later in the show about effective ways of using Stack Overflow, since it is required skill nowadays. But before that, I want to get to know a little bit more about your story and the story of Stack Overflow.
Sure.
Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, sort of strange. Most people, when they tell the story of their company, don't usually have to introduce it in terms of another company. And so we kind of started as a reaction to Experts Exchange, which at this point, thankfully, not a lot of developers even remember. But if you were a developer and you were working in the era before Experts Exchange and you had a problem programming and you typed it into Yahoo or AltaVista or even Google at some point, you often ended up on Experts Exchange, which was one of the early programming forums. I wouldn't say it was really questions and answers. It was more of a forum for programmers, which was mostly full of questions and answers. And Experts Exchange had a nice run of being free and open to the public, but then failed as a business. And when they failed as a business, I believe that the story is that somebody else bought it and immediately put up a paywall and started charging a monthly fee to get into Experts Exchange and saying, well, this is how we're going to succeed as a business. And that was sort of infuriating to people because they had contributed all of their knowledge to this site as a volunteer effort, sort of out of generosity and out of a desire to help other people on the internet. And now suddenly there was kind of a private enterprise trying to make money off of that. And there was also this sort of deceptive thing that they did with Google where they gave Google the answer. Google does not actually show results that go to a page that you have to pay for. That's always been an important principle of Google. And so they did this sort of deceptive thing where they showed Google the results, but they didn't really show you the results. And we can go on about that for days and days. The main point is that the previous dominant player for a place where people might get answers to their problems was charging a lot of money. And it was sort of unfair because the answers were coming from the community who were writing the answers on a volunteer basis. And so when we started Stack Overflow, it was pretty easy just to say, hey, we're just going to be like that, only not evil. And when we looked around, actually, we saw that since the time of forums, a lot of neat stuff had been invented on the internet about ways that you can make communities work better and function better. And so we kind of adopted as many of those ideas as we could into Stack Overflow. So just things like voting on answers and then making the best answer rise to the top, and then giving people a reputation that's based on how many votes their answers received. That's all stuff which is now relatively commonplace, but made Stack Overflow much cleaner and nicer. So instead of finding a conversation when you come in from a Google search, what you find is just the answer right there at the top. And that was a little bit non-obvious. People thought, well, it's a forum. You're not going to be able to understand the conversation if you don't read it in chronological order. And lo and behold, it turns out that that's not the right order for a Q&A forum. The right order is, let people vote on how good the answers are. And so there was a bunch of stuff like that we kind of incorporated early on, and we made it a big hit. But honestly, we got an awful lot of help out there from the big incumbent player just being a for-pay site, and then we figured out how to do it for free.
Prior to starting Stack Overflow at Fog Creek, you had almost the opposite approach where you said, free is over, we're going to make things that people pay for.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. That was a very popular thing in the year 2000 because there was this whole crash of the dot-coms. And Evan Williams, who created Twitter and later Odeo and finally Medium. Oh, and before Twitter, it was Blogger. Anyway, that's Evan Williams. And he had written a blog post called The End of Free, which was surprisingly influential. And it's now gone. I don't think you can find it even. I don't even know if the Internet Archive has it. But he wrote this very, very influential piece around then saying, like, look, there was this weird thing that happened because the internet started out as a research project. And so everything on it was sort of free by accident. And in fact, later it was a government research project. And so there was some kind of stipulation that you agreed not to use it for commercial purposes. And so there was this weird history of the internet that it started out saying things shall be free. And oddly enough, there was this belief that everything on the internet had to be free, but there doesn't actually have to be the case. We were assuming that, but maybe that's not really true. And so when all of these companies that had started out offering ridiculous things for free on the internet all failed, there was kind of a backlash, and that was what Ev's blog post was about, the end of free. Maybe we can't actually do this anymore. Turns out that it wasn't the end of free, and that was wrong. But that was just the generation, I guess. That was the era.
So even though it wasn't the end of free, there's still a contrast between two different kinds of companies, the get big fast kind versus organic growth. You talked about this at Y Combinator Startup School. Could you please explain the difference between get big fast companies and maybe how Stack Overflow became get big fast by accident?
Yeah, there's an article. There's an article on my blog, or an old blog post called Ben and Jerry's versus Amazon, and it kind of goes into all the different differences, because whether a company is oriented to be a fast growth company or oriented to be sort of a slow growth company determines an awful lot of things, and you kind of have to decide, and then you got to line them all up. Because if you try to be one, but then you do the other, then you kind of fail. Like if you're in a business that needs to be fast growth, but you're trying to do it as slow growth, then somebody else will take over. And I've made that mistake myself at times, and I've seen that mistake made a lot. The key decision point is really, I think, probably understanding whether this is a brand new thing that's going to be a dominant thing that everybody does. I like to call those land grab situations. If there's a new thing, such as Q&A using gamification or bug tracking or distributed version control systems, whatever that new thing is, and literally nobody is doing it, and at some point in the future, literally everybody will be doing it, then the best strategy is probably to be a fast growth company in that situation, whatever that means, and to grow as fast as possible, to try to capture as much territory as you can, so to speak, so that you end up being the dominant player. Because in that particular situation, the slow growth person will lose out to the fast growth person. I mean, the other kind of company is where you say, you know what, I want to start a music festival. And there's already a million music festivals. So now you have to compete against all the incumbent music festivals, and you have to somehow do it better. But if the way that you're going to do it better is by growing faster, that's kind of wishful thinking. And if the way you're going to do it better is by spending more money, then you have the Fire Festival, which was a well-known disaster that was not even successful, even if they had spent the money. And you still don't have kind of an audience. So in that particular business, you got to quietly pry away customers from other businesses, so to speak. That's not a land grab. That's more of a build a business in an established category. And in an established category, you really have to build for the long term, and you have to build from a position of bootstrapping with profitability. And you can invest a little bit, but you have to be really careful about what you're doing. And so those are the two kinds of businesses, I think.
Fog Creek was started basically with the idea of being slow growth versus Stack Overflow. It became evident really quickly that it was growing fast, incredibly fast.
Yeah.
But then there could be situations in the middle, and maybe you could talk about Trello. Is that a situation in the middle? Because it seems like there are sort of Kanban board type software out there. There could potentially be incumbents, but then you ended up making it into a product that did achieve a lot of scale. And how did you manage to identify the right strategy for that?
I think Trello is actually in a kind of a greenfield market, believe it or not. I do think it had to be fast growth. And we thought that even at the beginning. Although it looks like a Kanban board at first, it's nothing about how it functions in the marketplace is Kanban board like. And very few of the Trello boards that are out there in the wild are being used in the same way as a Kanban board, with cards progressing from left to right. And actually, that was sort of one of the key insights that caused it to be in a much larger category than the Kanban category, which confused the heck out of all the people that were doing Kanban boards. And they looked at Trello and they're like, why is this such a big deal? We've had this since 1903 or whenever they had it. So it was always meant to be kind of a high growth business. We always intended that. We always knew it. And the only thing that was middle about it is that for a while, for the first, trying to remember, I think 11 employees of Trello, we were able to just fund that completely out of Fog Creek's profits. And that gave us the opportunity to delay raising venture capital for Trello until it was already a huge success. And raising venture capital when you're already a huge success is easy, and you give up less equity. And so that was kind of everything went right in the story of Trello. Kind of, we got to raise VC a little bit later, and actually that particular story is repeating itself with Glitch right now. I'm not the right person to go into the details, but Glitch is sort of another example of something that was funded internally at Fog Creek for quite a while from the profits of the other businesses, and was able to grow and achieve, very, very rapid growth internally, which made it easier, it hypothetically makes it easier to raise venture capital should they choose to do so. So those are what I would call kind of a fast growth business. And then it's just that we were kind of lucky enough to get to the Series A without really having a seed round, or an angel round, so to speak, and thus making the terms in the first fundraising round better.
Could you go into detail a little bit more about that for our listeners that maybe don't have experience with venture capital or startups? Maybe it seems like common sense, but as a developer, I don't understand the way that venture capitalists think.
Yeah.
So could you run through that example a little bit and explain how did it make fundraising easier?
Okay, let's start with what is a venture capitalist doing? They're investing money in companies that have the potential to grow a huge amount, but also might be complete failures. And so what their profile looks like if they're successful is, maybe I invested in 20 companies and 2 of them were unbelievably huge successes that returned all the money that I put in and then some. And then maybe 3 more kind of returned a decent amount of money and all the other ones failed. So that's what the world looks like from a venture capitalist perspective. And so when you're looking for money, you're not so much looking for a sure thing. You're looking for something that, if it is successful, is going to return 1,000-fold, or even whatever. It's going to return 10x your money. That's considered a huge success. It's like I put in $1 million and I got $10 million back a few years later. So that's their perspective. That's what they're looking for. And if that's not what you want as a company, then that particular type of investment is not the right investment for you. So the second question is, if there's a bunch of people out there that want to invest in you, what's the strategy, assuming your business is going to be useful, what's the strategy to keep as much ownership of your company as possible rather than just kind of giving it all away to investors? So if you give it all away to investors, first of all, it's not good for you because you don't own it and then you don't get rich. But also, it's not so great for the investors because you don't have as much of a financial incentive to make the company successful if you don't own a big chunk of it. So you want to as a founder of a company, or to kind of maybe even I would say the first few employees of a company, theoretically you want to give away as few shares as possible in your company to investors, to VCs, all else being equal. So now the question is, when an investor invests in you, how much money will they give you in exchange for what percentage of your company? So we could call that kind of the multiple or something. And ideally, what you want to get is you want them to give you the maximum amount of money for the smallest possible percentage of your company, right? Like I would much rather somebody gave me $10 million for 10% than $10 million for 5%. No, I would rather $10 million for 5%, right? So what does that mean? That means that we would rather have the implied valuation of the company of that investment should be as high as possible. I want investors to consider my company to be as valuable as possible. So they're willing to pay a lot for a small number of shares. So what will cause investors to think my company is very valuable? Well, there are two things. One is it's making a lot of money. Another is it's growing really fast. But actually, there's sort of a third thing which dominates both of those, which is how risky is it really? How much chance is there that the whole thing blows up, or that there really is no market, or that the drug that you said that you're discovering turns out not to work, or whatever it is that you're trying to build is turns out to be a failure? How much risk is involved? And so the less risk there is, the more valuable your company is, and that should be kind of obvious, right? Because you're investing in a bunch of companies. They're all pretty risky, but you want the least risky ones should be worth more. Right. Now, how do you even define risk? How risky is a given startup? When you look at a startup, the way you define risk is by looking at the proof points. What has the company already proven? So there's a whole bunch of things that a company has to prove. Think of a startup starting tomorrow. You go out and start a new company. You got to prove a whole bunch of things before your company is worth $1 billion. Number one, you got to prove that you're even going to start the company. Number two, you got to prove that you can recruit some co-founders. Number three, you got to prove that you can get your first customer dollar. Number four, you got to prove that you can build the product that you want to build. If you need engineers to write code, you got to prove that they can code it. Then you got to prove that the market wants that code. Then you got to prove that if the market is using your program, that they will tell their friends about it, and therefore it will grow naturally through word of mouth. And then you got to prove what that growth rate is. And then you got to prove that this thing provides some value. And then you got to prove that people will pay for the value. And then you got to prove that the amount of money that they pay is more than the amount of money it costs you to provide the service. And therefore you can do this in a profitable way. So I could just list these all day long, and there's all these different things you have to prove. And a good venture capitalist will come in and say, okay, the more of these things that you prove, the more valuable your company is. It's not that I need you to prove them all in advance, like you have to give me a document proving everything formally before you get your first cent. It's like, I understand that you haven't proven any of these things, but the less of the things that you've proven, the less valuable your company is. So if all you've proven is that you have a good idea, your company might only be worth a small amount of money. And so I will give you a small amount of money, but you better be giving me a big percentage of your company in exchange for that small amount of money, right? So in that particular world, the way to think about it is the more things you can prove about your company, the more valuable it will be. And so you want to prove as many things as possible about your company early before you take that big investment. And if you're going to take multiple investments, which you probably should, you want to stage them so that each investment comes after you've just proven something very important. Like we just got to profitability, or we just got to the point where somebody is using our product and paying us for it. All of those proof points, or we just got to the point where we've hired an engineering team. Whatever those points are, they make your company more valuable. And so every time you make the company more valuable, you can raise a little bit more money at a better valuation. And if you follow that strategy, you'll end up controlling the largest potential percentage of your company. So in the earlier story that I told about Trello, luckily we had enough money to prove everything in-house. We were able to prove that we could build the product, that we could recruit the people, that it was usable, that people liked it, that when they used it, they shared it with their friends, that we could get people, I can't remember if we got people paying for it before we took the venture capital, but having proven a lot of those things and having a big base of millions of users already, then when you went out to VCs, they had to pay up. In other words, they had to pay high valuations because they knew that this was a reasonably successful company that had proven a lot of things that other companies had not proven. And what that meant was that the percentage of the company that we had to give to investors was much lower. And that meant that when we did sell Trello to Atlassian, we got to keep a higher percentage of the dollars that they gave us.
You explained that venture capitalists will gladly let a lot of their companies fail as long as a few key ones succeed. It sort of sounds like you might be the turtle that doesn't make it to the water.
Yeah.
And in that situation, what do you have to consider? Do you have to think about your tolerance for risk? Do you have to think about, do you want this company to succeed no matter what for some personal reason? How do you juggle that decision?
Those are all true things. Yeah, you have to think about your personal tolerance for risk. You also have to think about what's really, what has actually gone wrong and what's the actual situation you're in. Actually, even though people talk about companies just failing and then companies being super successes, in the average VC portfolio, there's a big middle of companies that you might think of as sometimes they're called the walking dead, which is a horrible term, but companies that are just not going to grow any further than they've already grown. They're not losing money. Maybe they're making a small amount of money and they're accomplishing some good for the world. The people like the products. It's just never going to be big. Maybe the leadership doesn't have a vision for getting any bigger than this. Maybe the market wouldn't support this particular idea any further than it's already gone. But for whatever reason, I think the VCs look at those companies and say, we've given up. We're probably not going to make that much money on these companies. It's best to at least save time and not waste any time with them. Because that's kind of the worst thing to a VC is if you've invested a day every week helping out some company that's not going to go anywhere. So, but to the person in that company, they may have accomplished their mission. They might have had a mission to, make the world better for turtles getting out to sea through innovative turtle application software, and they made it. And there's not a big market for that, but they're profitable and they're still going and they're meeting their mission, which was their goal, and that's fine. There's another thing when you think about risk, actually, is you do kind of have to ask yourself, is it so bad to fail? What's the real cost? And that has to do with your personal taste as a founder. The truth is that in the United States, in the high tech entrepreneurial economy, nobody's going to go hungry, honestly. If you've done a startup, if you built a thing, if you were able to raise some seed capital early on and get a couple of early customers, you've probably had enough money to live off of. Once you raise money, you're taking home a salary. So you're not in a worse scenario than having another job. Maybe it's a slightly lower salary. Maybe there was some opportunity cost for having done something better, but it's not like the punishment is that you get your head chopped off by a guillotine or you're sent to prison. The punishment is your worst case scenario. You have to work. You got to go get a job at JP Morgan.
That puts things in perspective. You said in one of your talks that people think of you as a risk taker, but you see yourself as more of a scaredy cat. Is that true? Like, how did a scaredy cat become founder of multiple successful companies?
As I get older, I kind of learn more about that, sort of the distinction between those two categories. One thing I've noticed about myself is I'm definitely not an early adopter. I don't have any of those devices in your home that you talk to them and then they tell you what the weather is. Out of sort of paranoia, I tend to be the last person to install the new social network. So I was able to completely skip Snapchat, which is nice. And that came and went. And I'm kind of hoping to be able to skip TikTok. But I'm always late to these little parties. I don't know why. I'm not interested in like the newest and the latest things. And I do tend to be very, very careful. And all the businesses that I've started, it's usually been because of just an overwhelming sense that there's an overwhelmingly obvious opportunity here. And I know all the steps and I can see how this would be done. And it all kind of makes sense. And I just have a real feeling of like, there really is no risk here. This is a clearly obvious thing.
That's the late adopter's advantage.
Yeah, it can be. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're copying somebody. But it does sort of speak to sort of the obviousness of the opportunity. I think Stack Overflow is one of those things. It was really weird to me that nobody started it. I mean, there was the whole time that this experts exchange shenanigans on Google was going on was probably 5 years where every developer was like, oh, I hate it when you do any kind of search and experts exchange comes up and then you click on it and it asks you to pay and you can't. And then that was just like, how hard is it to make? Why did nobody just take forum software, generic, cheap, online web forum software and slap it up somewhere and say, hey, go here instead of Experts Exchange, you guys. And that'll be the new alternative. And I kept thinking somebody was going to do that, and it shocked me that nobody did. And after like a year of nobody doing that, when I first had the idea for Stack Overflow, that was like, hey, we just got to do this. Somebody's got to do this. It's got to happen.
If you'd seen somebody else doing it, do you think you would have gone forward?
Oh, I would have helped them. If like somebody already had it, I'd be like, yay, good. Everybody go here. Another thing I want to say is that some of the most successful businesses, I won't say 100%, but I would go with like 94% of the most successful entrepreneurs and founders are founders who are huge believers in the thing that they're building. They would do it anyway, even if they're doing it because of a mission. They're like, the world has to be different. I'm doing this thing because the world is broken and I'm going to make the world better. The founders that are not so successful are the one who like, oh, I want to start a company. That sounds cool. I went and saw this movie called The Social Network with Mark Zuckerberg, and he made Facebook and he got rich and it seemed really fun. And I want to do that because that seems fun. What thing can I do that's fun? And then they sort of cast around for a business idea and they go for that. And that doesn't lead to anything. The successful founders are super mission driven. They see a huge opportunity. They need the world to be reconfigured in this particular way. And then they dive in to reconfigure it. And that's kind of what keeps them going through the hard times and the good is that mission-driven part. Because everybody else starts and then they just give up when the going gets tough. And that I think is often the hallmark of a good entrepreneur. Is you sort of ask them, well, if the thing that what would you do if you discovered that the thing you're trying to invent here already exists and somebody's already making it? And I think the good founder would say, oh, good, all right, now I don't have to work on that. I can work on something better or different. And then they just sort of step back. If somebody was really doing it well, if somebody's doing it badly, they would look at it and say, oh, yeah, but here's the problem. They don't understand that ABC, and I understand ABC, and therefore my thing is going to be successful, whereas that thing is not going to be successful. And we need this to both exist and be successful. So it's not enough that somebody else is doing it. It's got to work.
Your code is powerful, and so are you. And when you consider the reach of your code, it's clear that to deliver quality code, you must also deliver secure code. Where can you start? A first step is educating yourself on basic secure coding principles and beginning to put these principles into practice every day. Vericode's Secure Coding Toolkit is your go-to resource for all your secure coding needs. The benefits of our toolkit include learning best practices for secure coding, understanding how to secure your DevOps environments, learning to combat the most common software vulnerabilities. Stay secure and download this valuable asset today at www.vericode.com/SERadio.
Even when you started your first company, Bog Creek, you had a vision. You didn't see any good companies to work for in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
You saw that developers couldn't find a company they wanted to work for. Companies said they couldn't find developers. So you wanted to create a company that developers wanted to work for.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. It almost seems like you ran it like a pirate ship. Everyone was splitting the revenue. Is that true?
Yeah, there was a lot of that early on. We had profit sharing and we sort of just split up the profit. Yeah. Kind of to that point of the mission of the original Fog Creek, it was a little bit more, it's a simpler mission than the mission of Stack Overflow. It was just like, there's no good places for programmers in New York, which is strange. There's definitely good places in Silicon Valley, and there's good places like Microsoft is a great place to work in Seattle, or Redmond. And one thing that happened is like 3 or 4 years after I started Fog Creek, Google opened up a big office in New York and said, you know what, there's going to be a big office in New York, and there's going to be programmers there. There's going to be developers writing code in New York. And Google really got what it takes to make a place where developers want to work. And they were working on a kind of amazing mission, really cool stuff, lots of big computers you could play with. And I thought, God, if they had just started 4 years earlier, they could have saved me all this trouble, because I would have just gone and worked there. And I wouldn't have had to start Fog Creek. And it really was that. That's how you know the mission is. If somebody else had done it, you wouldn't bother. That's how you know that the mission is kind of the thing that's going to be the calling.
Do you think that that's caught on by and large at the companies out there? Like, are they making companies that you would want to work for today?
A bunch of it has. It has gotten, in general, it has gotten to be much better today to be a programmer than it used to be. There's one area where maybe I'm just in massive disagreement with the whole world, but I still think that there's way too many companies out there, even the 90% or more of companies think that the right way to make a work environment for programmers is just to put them all in big, long desks, shoulder to shoulder, in kind of a big one-room environment. And in fact, Facebook has now built, an 8-acre room for all their people to work in. And that seems to be kind of par for the course, is working together and having to overhear everything that goes on. And I'm still a big believer in private offices and quiet workspaces, especially for the kind of concentrating that you do as a programmer. I don't want to overhear conversations as a programmer at all, ever. I want to be able to concentrate and get work done. And when I'm done, I'm happy to go into the Slack channel and see what people have been talking about. And I'll catch up then, but please don't interrupt me with something, least of all, something interesting that's going to drag me away, because when you leave coding for even a minute, you go back to it, you've forgotten everything. So I'm this huge believer in quiet private workspaces, whatever that means. It doesn't necessarily have to be a private office, but at Stack Overflow, everybody either has a private office or works from their own home, where, by the way, even though we love remote workers, they are required to have a quiet private place at home. It can't just be, the dining room table, unless that's quiet and private in your home. But that is, I think, a requirement. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that you see now that's very, very commonplace across Silicon Valley. It might be free lunches, free soda, dry cleaning services on site, all the kind of stuff that's really meant to, first of all, signal to developers that they're important, but also just give them kind of a plush environment to work from, which shows respect for the value of the work that they're doing, which I think is extremely valuable. And I started Fog Creek because nobody valued programmers in New York City. They really thought of programmers as being some kind of awkward typist that's just annoying.
I want to talk more a little bit later about how our listeners can make sure that they find the right company that provides the right environment so they can be happy, they can feel productive. But while I have you in the ranting mood, a lot of what I like to read about your blog, and people I knew in my previous company enjoyed sharing your articles, and it's because of those rants about how to make your workplace good. And I think that there's a certain catharsis as a developer. Like, I know there's something wrong. At least, I feel like somebody understands.
Yeah.
It's interesting that now Stack Overflow is almost like a remote first company. Whereas before you were talking about how people should be in an office, it should be a nice environment. And you haven't changed that. You're still consistent with that point of view. But now you're bringing in this remote concept. And I would love to hear you rant about how to do remote work right and how are people doing remote wrong.
Yeah. The quick answer is that when you're on a remote team, it has to be remote first. So taking one person and making them a telecommuter is not going to work, because the rest of the team will ignore that person, and that person will rapidly get out of the loop, and that'll cause problems. So if you're going to have a remote team, it has to either be everybody's remote, or in some cases, like at Stack Overflow, there are people who come into the office, but they always work through the internet with each other. They don't go into a meeting and have a meeting in a room. The meetings are online. The technology has gotten better, which is why I changed my mind. Now we have video conferencing that's, for all intents and purposes, free. That's excellent, where you can have as many people as you want in a video conference. We have Slack, which is cheap, and we have even free versions of that are available. So it's easy and cheap now to do a good job of allowing people to communicate through typing, through chat rooms, through the tools that they use, like if you're using GitHub and just reading each other's check-ins and commits, through video conferencing, and even just audio conferencing, although I prefer video if it's going to be somebody you work with regularly. And the tools have gotten so good that there's no reason to physically come into the office anymore, as long as everybody's using them. If you have this weird situation where there are 5 people and they decide to have a meeting, they go into a conference room, and now there's one person who, he lives in Portland, so he's not here. And so they got to fiddle around a little bit with the video conferencing system. And now that person is on a TV screen, but everybody else is in person. That's not a real meeting. That person is already in a less good position. So that's the way that you have to do it. Another important thing that we learned is that everybody has to be approximately on the same time zone. So the guideline I've used since the beginning of time is, for an engineering team, pick your time zone and then make sure that everybody's there during the afternoon of that time zone. For us, it's the New York afternoons. And that means if you're on the East Coast, you got to work New York afternoons and you can stay later, or you can come in earlier. If you're on the West Coast, you got to get to work by 9 a.m. because that becomes New York afternoon. If you're in Europe, you're going to have to stay a little bit late and work during other people's dinner time, but that may not be a problem for you. If you're in Asia, you can't do it. And that's what it means to pick a time zone. And what that means is that the team is always there. And so you can have conversations with people at the drop of a notice. Because the real problem happens if you start to split people up between, let's say, India and San Francisco. Now they are, I'm not sure what the number is, I think 10 and a half hours apart or something like that, 10 hours apart. That's enough so that they're never working at the same time. And that means that every conversation has an incredibly high latency thing built into the conversation, like right in the middle of every sentence. So you can't have a rapid back and forth and gain understanding with somebody. And when you start doing that, you're like, oh, wow, I got to tell the Indian dev team that they need to do A, B, and C. And you fire off an email and you send it to them. And you don't expect them to see it until they get to work in 6 hours. And then they get to work and they see it. And they don't understand or they misunderstand, but you don't even know that. And so maybe they fire back a list of questions. And then you fire back a list of answers. And now a week has elapsed. Do the math. And now and you don't realize that you're going to be in this state for another 4 weeks before you say, you know what, this is taking too long. Can we just get on the call together? And now somebody's got to wake up at 2 a.m. So that is another example of something that does not work with the remote teams. So never do that. But we've had a lot of success where people are working at the same time for most of the day. And there's always time on any given day to have a rapid back and forth and make decisions.
Have you been able to scale out to other time zones, like pick some part of the product or pick some separate product and put them in a separate time zone, or has that not worked for you?
You always want to, but it's very hard to have. I'm sure that if at scale you could figure out ways to do it. If you're a company like Amazon that has a lot of microservices, or a company, let me think of an example. If you have done a really good job of splitting up your services in such a way that the interfaces between them are almost commercial, right? Like, so for example, if somebody needs storage, if a programmer working at Amazon needs storage, they're going to use Amazon storage and they're using a commercial Amazon product that is available commercially. And so because because Amazon has created the boundary between how they do storage and the entire world, meaning they have a product support site and there's escalation and there's tech support and you can figure out how much everything costs and you can pay for it. Because that exists as a service that's available to everybody, it's certainly available to internal Amazon programmers. And the kind of the formality of the definition of the barrier between those two things is so strong that you can make it work. And if you had that, I believe you could make it work. In reality, I just think of one time where I had a remote team that was not on my time zone. And I thought, I got to define a contract with that team of exactly what I need them to deliver. And I wrote the most detailed spec you've ever seen in your life. You would read it and you would be astonished at how little it left to the imagination. And I created C++ header files and said, your whole job is just to implement these header files. The header file defined the detailed interface that I wanted with this team. And all they had to do was write the code that met my interface requirements. And in fact, they did almost to deliver that. However, I did not make a definition of how high quality it has to be. And there was stuff that I left out of the interface because there was stuff that I forgot or I didn't know or I couldn't figure out until it was built. And once it was built, I looked at it and I said, this is really interesting. If you guys had been in the room next to me, you would have come in here and said, excuse me, this thing that you wrote doesn't make sense. But because you couldn't reach me, you tried to implement a thing that didn't make sense. And then you just sort of left it at that and delivered that as your deliverable. So the real question is, can you make it work if you're not in the same time zone as the other people, or maybe if you don't even speak the same language as the other people? And that requires such a formal separation of affairs that is so well defined and so formalized that it's almost impossible to make that, to pull that off in any normal organization.
It sounds almost like it needs to be separate companies at that point.
Yeah, or it could be the same company as long as whatever the borderline is between the companies is something that you sell and buy, that is sold and bought on the market, that's sort of generically available, right? Like, so I've got, I don't know, I can make up an example, but if this is the thing I could buy from anybody, I can certainly buy it from myself. But if it needs more definition than that, it's got to be more custom than that. Then the level of conversation we're going to have in order to figure that thing out, engineer it and design it correctly, figure that integration point is going to require a lot of rapid back and forth. And if we can't do that rapidly, then we're going to do that slowly. And if we do it slowly, we're going to lose.
Is there anything that people are under investing in, whether the companies, like a remote company, is not investing in certain technology? Your thing back in the day was companies should spend money on comfortable chairs and big monitors and an office with a door that closes.
Yeah.
But what's the equivalent now that people are under investing in?
Wow, man. Yeah. The big monitors. Wow. Isn't that amazing that developers don't have all the monitors they want?
Hmm.
They don't have CRTs anymore. It has gotten a lot better. It's gotten better, certainly in the world that we know of mainstream sort of Silicon Valley. The norm has gotten really, really good there for getting developers the things that they need. I think it's still a common thing that I still see occasionally is the sort of false economies. And sometimes it's not even the company that's making those decisions. A lot of times that comes from the developers, where we'll go into a company. We had this problem with FogBugs, and we have this problem with Stack Overflow Enterprise. We'll go into a big company and we'll say, hey, we have Stack Overflow. It works great. 30 companies have installed it, and they're all having fantastic success with developers in-house asking questions, getting answers, and it works amazing. And they use it even more than they use the main Stack Overflow, if you can believe that. They use their internal one a lot more. And so it's a huge success. And these other companies say, yeah, I don't doubt it. And we say, would you like to buy it? And they say, well, we kind of have a thing. And you're like, what do you have? And like, well, we sort of built something in-house using some kind of macros. I'm not sure. You're like, how are you not sure what you have? And they're like, I don't know. I don't use it. Like, does anybody really use it? And then you sort of, if you dig into it, you discover that there's a team of 6 people maintaining an internal thing at great cost that nobody uses because they don't know what it is or what it's called, because it's not called Stack Overflow. But it's costing them a fortune to have their own little proprietary little, I made it here. How hard could it be to make a Stack Overflow clone? And it turns out it is hard. And the amount that they're spending on their little proprietary in-house one that's not working is way more than it would cost them just to buy it from us and get one that has 10 years of work put into it. And, every corner has been polished to within an inch of its life, because we've been working on this for 10 years and making it great for every possible situation. It's like, why use that one that you have in-house at much greater cost? So there is sort of a common thing where I think developers just always feel like they can roll their own wheel, and they're always inventing their own stuff instead of just going and buying something that already exists, that's readily available on the market, because they kind of underestimate the value of their own time. They underestimate how hard it's going to be, and they underestimate the gap between how much work it takes to make an acceptable Q&A website and make a great Q&A website. And the gap there is like 99%. Like, it's 1% of the work will get you functioning Q&A in a web form of something that you can distribute to your coworkers, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I see how this kind of works like Stack Overflow. But then you need to do 100x as much work to really get all the corner cases and the bells and the whistles and make it really, really successful.
Okay. Yeah, that point's well taken. It's a good illustration of false economies, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
I probably have to insert some kind of disclosure that at one point, Stack Overflow was running an ad for Stack Overflow Teams on this podcast.
Oh, cool. Hey, everybody, use Stack Overflow Teams.
Yeah. So this is not an ad. We're not being paid to have you on the show or something like that.
Thank you.
But no, we have you here for your point of view. But yeah, the point's well taken. So we're starting to get to the end of time. We have about 5 minutes left. And there are a few things that I promised to talk about. We could revisit, but I want to make sure that we cover anything that you want to talk about that we haven't covered yet. So the things that I promised to talk about were developers using Stack Overflow, how to use it effectively.
Yeah.
And the other thing was how to make sure that you find the right company and the right team to work on.
Okay.
Did you want to cover one of those, or did you want to cover something else?
So I'll do 3 things that'll cover all these topics. One is how to ask questions effectively, and how to use Stack Overflow effectively. I think, and most of the time, the question you're looking for is already on there, and so getting good at search will really help you a lot. But there's a great article by John Skeet about how to ask questions on Stack Overflow. It's called Writing the Perfect Question. So if you just you could Google Writing the Perfect Question or Google John Skeet How to Ask. That's a great article. That's a great source for people that are about to write their first question online or have been doing it and not getting very good responses. 2 important points that I want to make there is, number 1, make sure that you've explained the question in a way, like try explaining it to a rubber duck on your desk, or a stuffed bear, or even your coworker, and make sure that you have correctly even formulated the question that you want to ask in a way that at least one other person can answer. Because a lot of times people write questions and it's not even clear what they're asking, or they haven't really included all the information that somebody would need to help them with their problem. And the other part is, see if you can get down to the minimum amount of code that demonstrates the problem that you're facing. So the perfect question on Stack Overflow is going to be, I did this, and then maybe 1 or 2 lines of code. And I expected this, and a description of what they thought that would do. But what I got was this other thing, and then an explanation of what they actually got. And that's almost the perfect question, and it's always going to get you an answer if you can include those three parts: what you did, the minimum possible use case of what you actually did, what you thought that was going to do. Because if you just told us what you got, and we all think that that's correct because that's right, then we're not helping you. And what you expected to get, and then we can kind of help you. So that's the how to ask a question part. The second thing you asked was how to know if you got the right job. It's worth still looking up the Joel test. I hope that is still number one in Google for Joel test. The Joel test, 12 steps to better code. It's basically 12 quick questions that you can easily get answers to as a part of your normal interviewing process whilst interviewing for a company. And they're a little bit out of date, but if you should be able to figure them out. So for example, item number 6, do you have an up-to-date schedule? Let's say that you're going in and interviewing at a company and they're working on a big version of some new particular project, then you could just ask them, can you tell me what the schedule is? When do you expect this to ship? And where are you up to? What percentage is complete? And if they sort of say, yes, here's the schedule, we have 27 items and we have knocked off 12 of them, that's an organized company. That's going to be pleasant to work there. Stuff is going to, the trains run on time at that company. If you go to a company and you say, when's this going to work? And you're like, it'll be finished when it's finished. It's like, it keeps slipping. We don't know, but we keep adding things and then blah, blah, blah. You're going to discover that that's a company where the trains do not run on time. You are not going to enjoy working with that company. So there are 12 things like that on the Joel test, which you can use and you can ask as you go through the process of interviewing for a company before you start there. That was your second thing. And then you were nice enough to say, is there anything else you want to talk about? And there is something I want to talk about, which is what it means to be friendly on Stack Overflow. So I believe many of your listeners are Stack Overflow users, and many of them, thankfully, are writing answers to questions and trying to help people, both newbies and experts, on Stack Overflow. And that's very much appreciated. And that's sort of a wonderful thing about Stack Overflow is it really is this massive volunteer effort that is absolutely fantastic to see of people helping each other. And I only want to say one thing about that, and it's because it's a thing that we're really, really focused on Stack Overflow, which is how to be more welcoming to newcomers in the field of programming. And that doesn't mean doing their homework for them. And that doesn't mean when somebody comes in with a really stupid question, they've done no work and no research, and they kind of expect you to do all their work for them, that you even have to give them the time of day. However, do remember that it is very hard to speak up in a room when you're a newcomer, especially if you don't look like the other people in the room. So if you're a person of color, if you're a woman or some other minority, you are in a minority of programmers. And when you go into a room full of people that don't look like you, it's a little bit harder to feel welcome. And so if that room of people kind of ignores you, you won't feel welcome. If they're rude to you, that's awful. You're a newcomer, they should be polite to you. But even if they're merely polite to you, that can feel a little bit unwelcoming. They really, as a newcomer, people kind of have to make an effort to reach out and actually be actively friendly, not just neutral. And that's something that I want to see a lot more of on Stack Overflow, is that active friendliness. If you look at some of the Stack exchanges, do a really good job of that. And there's a lot of cases on Stack Overflow where you see that. But it's like, hey, I see this is your first question. It's a really interesting one that you asked, and here's the answer. And that's kind of one way of answering that question. A woman told me that she asked her first question on Stack Overflow, and the answer that she got was, oh, that's easy, followed by the answer. There's just those 3 words, oh, that's easy. There's nothing antagonistic about that. There's nothing mean about saying that's easy. But what the woman thought, who had asked this question, was, no, it isn't. It was not easy for me. I struggled with this for 5 hours before I finally realized that I had no recourse, and I had to ask on Stack Overflow, which was very scary and very daunting because all those very professional programmers were going to look at me strange. And they didn't even say something mean. They just said that's easy. And what that made me feel, she told me, was I felt like an imposter. I felt like maybe I don't belong in the field of programming, because if I'm having so much trouble with this easy stuff, then maybe I should go find a different career. And that was just wrong. That was just not factually correct. This stuff is all hard for everyone to begin with. And the person saying that's easy was possibly trying to even be friendly, certainly not trying to be unfriendly. But the net result was to kind of create this environment of making people feel like they're in the wrong place. I don't even want to say unwelcome. That's going too far. Making people feel like imposters. And that is a big, big problem, because we need a lot more developers than we have in the world today. And we need for the developers in the world today to be more representative of the population at large. So it's not just the Stanford graduates at Facebook deciding how the future of the world shall go. We need a much more diverse group of people programming and creating the future of the world as they write that code. And we gotta nurture those programmers and create those new programmers and developers on Stack Overflow. And it's funny, but to do that doesn't mean just being like, just the facts, here's your official answer. It means going further and kind of reaching out and being welcoming to the newcomers and saying, I'm glad you asked that because I don't see anybody else having asked that question. I can see why it's easy to get confused with that thing, but don't worry, you got this. Here's the answer. That's a completely different approach from, oh, that's easy, or here is your answer. So that's my little speech and rant, and I appreciate your having given me the platform to give you this rant, because this is something that's very important to us at Stack Overflow, is making that thing that all developers have to use, making it something that helps people get into the field of programming and get good at it, especially the people with good intentions, not the people that need homework help, but the people with good intentions, and encourages them and brings them into the field.
Joel, thanks for coming on the show and getting the message out there.
Thanks for having me, Nate.
For Software Engineering Radio, this has been Nate Black. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.